Good evening and welcome to IDFA's Immunodeficiency Insight webinar for tonight. Our topic is the gut-immune connection, understanding gut health, the microbiome and immune health. This session has been designed for people living with an immune deficiency, as well as their carers and families and the community more broadly. We're delighted to have you join us for what we hope will be an informative session. And we will have the opportunity at the end to ask some of our experts some questions. As you know, for many people living with an immune deficiency, gut health can become an important part of everyday life. Recurrent infections, frequent antibiotic use, digestive systems, and the growing amount of information online about the microbiome can make it difficult to know what's supported by evidence and what's not. This evening, we'll explore the latest understanding of the gut-immune connection and hear from experts who will share both scientific evidence and practical strategies to support gut health. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy our webinar. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Dharawal lands on which we are presenting from today and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. We also extend our respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us for the webinar. The webinar tonight will be recorded and shared on IDFA's website. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Immunodeficiency Foundation is Australia's peak body for those living with a primary and secondary immunodeficiency. Our key priorities are around education and awareness, both for our members, for health practitioners and for the general community. Care and support by building a community amongst our members, and we have about 2,500 members nationally. And our third pillar is advocacy. So we aim to drive change by advocating and supporting research into a range of significant issues impacting our members. Just an overview of the webinar tonight. So from here, I'll introduce the speakers. We'll then talk about nutrition, gut health, and a lived experience perspective. We'll then look at antibiotics, immunity, and the gut microbiome. Further information on the gut microbiome and the future of microbiome therapies. There'll be a short panel discussion and audience Q&A, and then we'll talk a little bit about IDFA resources, what's coming up at IDFA, and we'll do some poll questions at the end and close the webinar. So I would like to introduce our first presenter for tonight. Kelly Lambert is an accredited practicing dietitian and an IDFA member who will explore the relationship between gut health and immunodeficiency, discussing probiotics, nutrition, and practical ways to support gut health. So please welcome Kelly to present.
Thank you, Carolyn, and hello to everybody. Just sharing my screen. So thank you for the opportunity to present on this topic. It's definitely one I wear two hats with. One is as a mother of a child with CVID, and also as a dietitian and health professional. So just a disclaimer, this is general education tonight, not individual medical advice. So I would definitely encourage you all to check in with your immunology, and if you have a gastroenterologist, those doctors, to have a chat about your own circumstances based on what I discussed tonight. But hopefully I'll be able to answer some of the questions that were sent in prior, which was really fantastic to see what kind of interest people have. But before I answer some of those questions, what I'd like to do first is really just set the scene and explain a few of the concepts that we need to understand first before we talk about what we can do And that is to understand, what are we talking about when we're talking about the gut? Now, that's actually kind of a medical term, and not everyone realizes that it refers to the entire digestive tract. So that means all the way from your mouth all the way down to your anus. But a lot of the action happens in the large intestine. That's where most of the gut microbiota live. And that's often where people think we're just referring to, but it is the entire gastrointestinal tract. And the reason I'm telling you that is because there is some evidence that there are changes much higher up in the oral cavity, in the mouth, in people with immune deficiencies. And so there are, very special circumstances that we have to take into consideration. So with that in mind, what are we talking about when we're talking about gut health? It's a term that's thrown around so frequently, but not many people have actually heard what it's referring to. And there are formal definitions for this. So this is the formal definition that's been agreed globally for what we're talking about when it comes to gut health. And basically, we're talking about a state of normal gastrointestinal function, which means that you're living without any kind of gastrointestinal disease and you don't have any gut-related symptoms that affect quality of life, keeping in mind that gut refers to everything from the mouth all the way down to the bottom. So that gives you lots of scope to see that you can have problems in many places that still would impact your gut health. Now, I would like to make everybody feel very well understood in, knowing that gut problems are not uncommon in people with immune deficiency, and that is because the gut is actually the biggest immune organ in the body. And so when you have problems with your immune system, that's often one of the first places it shows up. The other reason that gut problems are quite common in people with immune deficiencies is because the gut is like a border zone, and we have, trillions of bacteria on one side of that gastrointestinal membrane, and on the other side is the bloodstream. And sometimes it's possible for some of those bugs to cross that barrier into the blood system and cause disease. So our immune system is constantly trying to make sense of whether the bugs that they're interacting with are friend or foe. And if you have impairments to that immune system, it's likely that they'll be crossing and causing potential problems. So gut problems are very common, and they affect 1 in 3 people with immune deficiencies, which is exceedingly common. Now, the other thing it's important to know about gut health problems in people with immune deficiencies is that they actually fall into 4 really broad, distinct categories. And why that matters is because the type of treatment that you would then perhaps undertake to help counteract some of these gut problems is dictated by the category of gut problem we're talking about. So we have those that are directly related to autoimmunity. We've got gut problems that eventuate as a result of secondary infections. We've got gut problems that might originate as a result of malignancy or cancer, and perhaps the treatments that you've undertaken as a result of that. And then we have gut health problems that are related to inflammation that's also common in some types of immune conditions like CVID. But what we do know from the very limited data that is available that has studied this problem in people with immune deficiencies is that there are many common symptoms. And the problem is that these symptoms are serious, they're uncomfortable, so it means that people often don't want to talk about them, and they're frequently overlooked as a result of something else, but they can actually be a direct result of your immune condition. So there's a few important symptoms we need to kind of flag, such as diarrhea, having blood in your poo. That's never a good thing. Ongoing tummy pain of, various kinds. It could be sharp, severe. It could be bloating. It could be discomfort as a result of eating. We then have things like abscesses or fistulas, which is where one part of the gastrointestinal tract attaches to another part and causes the contents to go where they shouldn't. And mouth ulcers, which is also a very common one in people with immune deficiencies. So these are things that, as you can see from the numbers, affect really large numbers of people, and you don't have to live with them. There's things that you should be raising with your treating team that if you're experiencing them, maybe it means that we need adjustments to treatment. The other issue that's important for us to know is that these kinds of symptoms can actually mimic other really important conditions that have very important consequences for adults and for children. So, for example, if you've got a child that's constantly complaining of tummy pain, and they're having some diarrhea, when that goes on for a long period of time, that can lead to malnutrition and growth failure. It can also lead to anemia. So we don't want people to ignore these symptoms, especially if you're having all of them, because that can lead to serious complications, but it might also be mimicking something far more serious. So the common question is, why would gut problems be so common in people with immune deficiencies? So I'm going to talk to you very briefly about what some of the science is, and I'll try and keep it as simple as I can, but it is actually a really complicated area, and I don't profess to be an expert in that. So let me simplify it as much as I can. Gut problems are common in people with immune deficiencies for two reasons, and the first one is related to the fact that the bugs that live in your gut, i.e. the gut microbiota, are actually impacted in many ways by either the treatment for immune deficiencies or by the immune condition itself. And what we have in our digestive tract is a whole bunch of specialised tissues. And as you can see from this very fancy diagram here, if we look at the large intestine, where it's down the bottom in your tummy region, what we have is specialised lymph tissue that helps maintain our gut health, and that's abbreviated as GALT. And we know that when you have alterations to the bugs that live in your gut, there are also alterations to those specialised cells. So it's kind of a flow-on effect to having a change in the types of bugs that live in your gut. And when you have immune conditions, as I said, there's going to be alterations in that, unfortunately. So we can't really avoid it. But what we do know is the following. There's a small number of studies about what happens to people with immune conditions. And when I say small, I mean around 15 globally. Most of the studies, i.e. 95% of those studies, only examine people with CVID. So if you have an immune condition other than CVID, we really don't know very much specifically. And none of those studies are Australian. And the reason that that matters is because your gut microbiota, so the bugs that live in your gut, are very much dictated by what you eat and where you live and your genes and what medications you take. So we would expect there to be some slight differences in the gut microbiota between people in New Zealand and Australia and Europe and China. And so we don't really know much about what happens in Australia. Now, why have I got pictures of fruit on the screen here? Well, I'm going to tell you a little metaphor about what happens to the bugs in your gut. In healthy people without immune conditions and without other chronic diseases, I want you to think of this picture of fruit salad as a representation of the types of bugs in your gut. And what we want to remain healthy is to have a very wide range of different types of bugs, and that's what's represented by the very broad range of fruit that you can see on the screen. And the reason we want lots of different types of bugs is because they all have varying functions. And when you limit it to a small number of types of fruits in this example, or a small number of types of bugs, it's more likely that there'll be negative consequences because you don't have the broad army available to fight off infections, which is what some of the gut microbiota do when you're only limiting it to certain types of soldiers. So hopefully that metaphor makes sense. And it's very important for me as a dietitian because what grows the types of bugs in your guts is actually food and what you eat. And so for me, my advice to people with an immune condition is very much about you need a wide variety of foods in your diet, particularly plant foods, because they are specifically what grow gut microbiota that help protect your health. So that's a very important point. Now, I just wanted to move on to this next slide. This is the second reason why gut problems are so common. And it's not necessarily related to the gut microbiota, but it is related to the fact that that cell wall, that gut wall defense is broken. Think of it like a wall where there's gaps that, negative bugs or bad bugs can sneak through. And that's because that cell wall is made up of lots and lots of different types of cells, but they're mostly mucosal tissues. And when we have immune conditions, what tends to happen is the beta cells and the T cells, or all the things that we need to fight off infections, actually aren't there, so the bugs can sneak in through the holes in the cell wall. That's probably the simplest way that I can explain that concept. So basically, what we've lost is the prevention against the invasion of pathogens to help maintain our gut health. Just moving on. So the second most common question I get as a dietitian is, do the types of gut symptoms that people have differ according to the type of immune deficiency? Yes, they do, but there's also very limited research on that. So the most commonly researched conditions are those that have antibody deficiencies. There's virtually no information around about those other types of categories of immune conditions. And unfortunately, that means the advice we give is quite limited. But what we do know is that there are some very important differences in the type of gut problems. So let me explain that a little bit more. So if you have CVID, because of the nature of that immune condition, we do know that you're more likely to have a condition called enteropathy, which stands for, or is another way of saying there's inflammation of the lining of the gut. And what that abbreviation there, IBD, stands for is inflammatory bowel disease, like inflammation. So what's happening there is that there could be inflammation of all 4 layers of the gut lining, or maybe it's only superficial and extends only through the first layer of the gut. Regardless of what's going on there, that has important consequences, and that might be why it's worth raising with your doctor to have a colonoscopy so they can have a look at the level of detailed damage to the gut lining. But the problem with having that type of condition and that type of impact is that it can increase the risk of certain types of gastrointestinal cancers, and that's why we need people to be monitored if there are evidence of those types of changes in their gut. So it's important not to ignore those gut symptoms. If you have an IgA deficiency, the evidence is that your gut health symptoms are likely to be slightly milder, and sometimes they present differently, and they're more like having celiac disease. So that means that your symptoms might be more like you're malabsorbing your nutrition. So you might have diarrhea that could be fatty, you could be bloated, there could be some types of foods that cause you more problems than others, and that's very different types of symptoms to those that have enteropathy. And then if you had chronic granulomatous disease, the symptoms there would be also slightly different. And if we looked at your inside of your gut lining under a colonoscopy, there'd be very important changes that could be identified there. And that means that you'd be given a different type of medical treatment potentially. So it is important that we understand that not everyone's going to experience the same type of symptoms, and it can be very much dictated by the type of your immune condition. So let's cut to the chase. What can you do? Well, let me start with some practical actions. So I've divided the things on the screen here into 4 categories of actions. The first one is we can't avoid antibiotics generally when we have immune conditions. They're often life-protecting. There is a trade-off. We know that it will impact the bugs that live in your gut, but it's sometimes a necessary evil, and we don't want you to avoid those treatments based on that. It is possible to restore some of those bugs back to a semi-healthy state, but I do know in my own personal experience, my daughter was on back-to-back antibiotics for 2.5 years, and so that's a really difficult challenge, and there's really no point taking probiotics whilst ever you're taking antibiotics. They just don't survive, so don't waste your money. Please make sure you complete your courses of antibiotics, and if you were considering of having some probiotics after you've been on antibiotics, please discuss that with your doctor. Your immunologist, your gastroenterologist, even as a GP would be able to give you some advice. And the reason I say that is because for the most part, people with immune deficiencies are generally excluded from clinical trials where they test the safety of probiotics. And there have been examples in the literature in real life of clinical trials being stopped early because people with immune compromised conditions were actually experiencing higher rates of side effects, including death. So it's not something that's benign for people with an immune condition. We don't want people taking them willy-nilly. It's a totally different scenario for people with an immune condition, especially children, and especially those that have SCID. Okay, next thing, diet. Diet's definitely something that you can manipulate to your favour. And we know that having a variety of plant foods, you don't have to be vegetarian, but please make sure you have the widest range of plant foods you can, is important for various reasons, including, but not least, fibre. Fibre is the fuel that helps grow the bugs that are known to protect your gut health, and they actually generate byproducts which help strengthen the lining of your gut wall. We know that having adequate hydration is also really important because that impacts the type of bugs that you grow in your gut. We want people to have a wide range of foods in their diet so that they can get a wide range of nutrients, because they also grow the types of bugs, positive bugs in your gut. And I had fluid there already, so I don't need to cover that again. The next one is about being a detective and making sure that you're monitoring what's happening. So if you had a child, for example, who was having gut symptoms and you're monitoring what's going on, what we want to do is see, is there a pattern of symptoms that you're seeing? Is it generally symptoms before some kind of decrease in their health status? Is it in relation to some particular medications? What's going on there? Having an idea of a pattern is really helpful. We also want you to monitor your weight, because it's very important for us to distinguish as health professionals if your weight is changing, and B, is your weight changing unintentionally? So is it going down without you wanting to lose weight, or increasing without you trying to? That's important for us to distinguish. And especially if you have chronic diarrhea, we need to have a look at what's going on. We need you to have poo samples taken. We need to have a look at what the pattern and even what the type of diarrhea is, because there's different types of diarrhea and we need to understand what's happening there. And the other final thing that you can do, doesn't sound very fun, I know, but it's important for you to weigh yourself regularly. Adults definitely, but children most importantly need to have their weight done regularly. Have a look and see if the poo that's in your toilet is showing evidence of malabsorption. And how would you know that? Well, generally smells really bad. It tends to float. It can be pale in colour, and there might even be little drops of oil in the bottom of the water in the toilet. If that's you, please go and see a doctor, because that means you're not absorbing fat-soluble vitamins, you'll be losing weight. It's very uncomfortable, and there's things that we can do. If you're experiencing increasing fatigue, there's reasons why we would need to explore that. It could be iron deficiency, it could be malabsorption, it could be other conditions that are a result of the gut health being impaired. And if you find that you've got unrelenting symptoms after any kinds of treatment, please let your doctor know so that we can flag it, because there's investigations that need to happen. So it's not something we need to bury our head in the sand. We do need to take them seriously, because there are things that we can do that are positive to improve some of your gut health, but sometimes these things are also unavoidable in the sense that we know that immune deficiencies are a course, a disease where you have a rocky course at many points during your life, and it's often helpful to have a plan of attack. If you've had, say, a course of antibiotics, what's your next thing you're going to do as soon as you stop that course? And for me, my personal experience with my daughter has been I make a plan that she then commences a diet with the hugest range of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and nuts and legumes as possible to help rebuild as quickly as possible the bugs that are living in her gut. So I'm just going to wrap this up quickly now. So, oops, sorry about that. My mouse is just not working. The best advice in terms of probiotics is to think of it a bit like this house. Probiotics to me are like painting the roof of a house, but when you've got really unstable, rocky foundations, meaning you're having frequent courses of antibiotics, you don't have a great diet, you're not watching your physical activity levels, you smoke, and you're taking lots of other competing medications, probiotics aren't really going to make much difference to your health. It can be a waste of money, and in some cases might even be dangerous. Okay, So here's my example of a really practical tool that we've used in many studies to help people understand what it means to have a wide variety of things. And there's a really important study that was done in America called the American Gut Project that showed if you have 30 different plant foods a week, we know that you have better health outcomes and definitely a gut microbiota profile that's much more positive and associated with positive health outcomes. Doesn't matter what type of plant foods they are, but here's some examples on the screen, and people often love thinking about that. Just means 5 or 6 different types of plant foods every day. So just to close, key messages. Your gut is closely connected to your immune system, so you're not making things up by thinking that you're struggling with your gut health if you've got an immune condition. They are real, distinct and diagnosable conditions. We do know that antibiotics and probiotics need individualised, discussed decisions. Don't start taking, for example, probiotics without a discussion with your healthcare team. If you have persistent irritable bowel syndrome-like symptoms, so diarrhoea, alternating with constipation, with bloating, with perhaps bleeding, please talk to your doctors about that and any recurrent infections that are associated with changes in gut health. And we know that long-term monitoring shouldn't be thought of as a burden. It's actually protective, not alarming that you need to have regular colonoscopies if that's where you are at. So thank you for letting me have this opportunity to share my experiences. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for that really practical and informative presentation. I'm sure everyone on the webinar will really appreciate the information and the practical tips that you've shared tonight. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, who is Louisa Tedesco. Louisa is a PhD candidate at the Centre for Cancer Biology at Adelaide University. Louisa's research focuses on immune dysregulation and primary immunodeficiency. And tonight she'll expand on the science behind gut health, including the impact of antibiotics, recurrent illness, and common misconceptions surrounding the microbiome. Welcome, Louisa.
Thanks, Carolyn. Just going to get up my slides. Please bear with me, everyone. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Louisa. As Carolyn has introduced me, I am a PhD student. My project actually focuses on a skin disorder called urticaria, but today I'll be looking at the gut microbiome with you guys. I'm so excited. Just a heads up, I'm not a clinician. I'm not giving any medical advice. As a student researcher, I like to pick up my magnifying glass and take a deep dive into the science behind really interesting hot topics. Let's get started. There's a lot of noise about the gut microbiome at the moment. You've probably heard some things like, wow, the gut microbiome, it's a brand new field. Or there's only such things as good bacteria and bad bacteria. Or maybe even that your gut microbiome is inherited and there's nothing you can do to influence it. In fact, these are all myths. The gut microbiome has been associated with disease outcomes since the early 1900s. That's when Dr. Henry Tissier discovered that infants with more of a bacterial species called bifidobacterium in their gut had less severe diarrhea and gastrointestinal infections. Fecal microbiota transplantation, which is also thought to be a modern invention, was actually pioneered back in 1958, where it was used to successfully treat 4 patients with Clostridium difficile overgrowth. We'll learn a bit more about FMT from Dr. Sam later on. Now about good and bad bacteria. It's hard to say that any certain bacteria are bad or good. It is totally context dependent as to whether bacteria will help you or harm you. If you're unwell or live with immunodeficiency, your immune system could be exhausted, suppressed, or overactive. In these scenarios, bacteria that would normally happily live in the gut could switch identity and cause disease. How about the nature versus nurture debate? Can you influence your gut microbiome? How you're born plays an interesting role in the founding strains, meaning the types of bacteria that first set up shop in your gut. However, the microbiome is a dynamic ecosystem that constantly overwrites itself. There are many environmental factors, as Kelly mentioned earlier on. that influence how your microbiome changes over the course of your adult life. The food you eat, who you associate with, where you live, your job, if you have any pets, or even certain medications you take. These factors can all influence what your microbiome will look like. Okay, now we've got that out of the way. What exactly is the gut microbiome? This is a basic diagram of your gut. Your gut lining is made up of cells connected by tight junctions, which are like little Lego bricks that snap together and keep the gaps between these cells nice and tight so that only very small molecules can pass through. Covering the top of your gut lining is a mucus layer made up of water and sticky sugars called mucins. Now, the idea that your gut is covered in a layer of snot might sound a bit gross, but it's actually very important. It lubricates digested food and waste as it moves through the gut and keeps a physical barrier between what goes on inside your gut and underneath your gut, where you have tissue called lamina propria, blood vessels, and many types of immune cells. You have many living things inside your gut, not only bacteria, but also fungi, viruses, and maybe even parasites. But bacteria are the most studied. You have many types of bacteria in your gut, and the balance of species varies from person to person. This is what researchers will refer to as the gut microbiome. Now, here are some helpful definitions before we move forward. The types or strains of bacteria that naturally live in your gut are called commensals. The ones that don't belong there and can harm you and cause disease are called pathogenic bacteria. Your microbiome feeds back to your immune system in many ways, one of which is through metabolite signaling. A metabolite is a chemical produced by a cell, in this case, your gut bacteria, which can then be used by other parts of your body. For example, when your bacteria ferment fiber from the diet you eat, they produce a metabolite called short-chain fatty acids, or SCFAs. SCFAs are metabolites that can cross the gut barrier. Once they reach your immune cells, they switch on signals that reduce inflammation. Not only that, but SCFAs can increase the production of those tight junctions. Remember those Lego bricks that snap the cells of your gut barrier together? And this strengthens the integrity of your gut barrier. So what happens to the microbiome and the gut barrier in the case of primary immunodeficiencies, which I'll be referring to as PIDs for short? An important component of our immune system is our immune cells. We have immune cells all over our body, including, as we've seen, within our gut. Your immune cells help coat your commensals and keep pathogenic bacteria in check. In PIDs, gut bacteria can become unbalanced, so your gut is more likely to become inflamed. Sometimes the problem is that there are fewer immune cells or antibodies to maintain normal gut defense, such as with PIDs like SCID or CVID. In other PIDs like IPEX and CGD, the immune cells are there, they can't regulate inflammation, or they just don't function properly. It is also important to note that antibody deficiency disorders like selective IgA deficiency means that there are less IgAs to coat your commensals, which helps them stick into that mucus layer. If they don't have that IgA coating, they can lose their anchor point and get washed away. IgA also helps clump disease-causing bacteria together. Having less IgA means that less of these pathogenic bacteria clumps are made, so your immune system finds it harder to identify and clear them away, further contributing to inflammation in your gut. This combination of disrupted immune cell communication and less antibody production reduces your body's ability to tolerate and maintain commensal bacteria populations, allowing pathogens to overgrow and impair the gut barrier. This causes loss in those tight junctions, allowing unwanted materials to leak from inside your gut outside into your surrounding tissues, further contributing to inflammation. Each of these impacts on gut health lead to major dysbiosis. Dysbiosis means that your gut is in an unbalanced state. Your gut will likely try and recruit more immune cells to clean up the mess and restore balance, which tend to cause further inflammation and gut problems down the track. For those of you here who live with primary immunodeficiency or care for someone who does, you might be thinking about where antibiotics fit into the picture of gut health. Many people with PIDS are prescribed long-term antibiotics to prevent respiratory, lung, and ear infections. Because the immune system has a deficiency, longer courses or higher doses of antibiotics may be needed when infections do occur, as they can take longer than usual to clear. When you take a course of antibiotics, they mainly target bacteria in 3 different ways. Firstly, one type of antibiotics attaches to sugar groups on the outside of bacteria, destabilizing the cell membrane, causing its contents to spill out. Other antibiotics jam themselves into hamburger-shaped proteins called ribosomes, which stops protein making in its tracks. Lastly, antibiotics also damage genetic material, which disrupts bacterial growth and reproduction. Here we can see that antibiotics are generalized killers, meaning that they can't distinguish between which bacteria cause disease in the gut and which ones are just happily living there. Clinicians prefer narrow-spectrum antibiotics for this reason, as they target only select types of bacteria. However, it is important to note that broad-spectrum antibiotics are usually the go-to for treating acute infections in primary immunodeficiency. This is because people with PIDS are vulnerable to a wide range of pathogenic bacteria and can deteriorate rapidly if treatment is delayed while they're waiting for pathology results. Now we know what antibiotics do, let's discuss how they impact the gut microbiome. As we discussed earlier, antibiotics kill bacteria indiscriminately. This leads to a sharp drop in microbial diversity. Remember that fruit salad that Kelly was talking about earlier? Microbial diversity is a measure of how many different strains and species live in your gut. Key commensals can be significantly depleted even after just one course of antibiotics. A recent Nature Medicine study showed that the effects on microbial diversity can be seen from up to 4 to 8 years after taking a single course of antibiotics. This loss of diversity, also known as an antibiotic scar, creates a dangerous power vacuum in the gut. Normally, your commensals take up all the available space and nutrients, effectively starving out pathogens. When antibiotics wipe out your commensals, that competitive barrier is broken. Harmful pathogens suddenly have free real estate and an abundance of food, allowing them to grow completely unchecked and cause secondary infections. This damage also extends deeply into our immune defenses. Our gut microbes constantly send chemical signals to keep our immune system sharp and active. When antibiotics deplete these signaling bacteria, this diminishes key regulatory immune cells and protective signals, weakening the gut lining and compromising our overall immune protection. So, in summary, there are still many unknowns about the gut microbiome, but this is what makes it such an exciting field. We've done some myth busting, learning how the microbiome is a dynamic immune system and how there are many lifestyle factors that can influence the gut microbiome. We've seen how primary immunodeficiency can impair the gut immune connection and that antibiotics can't distinguish between bacteria that can help us and those that harm us. While each course of antibiotics leaves a scar on the gut microbiome and can lead to gut dysbiosis, your microbiome does have the ability to recover. There is emerging evidence that probiotics can help manage symptoms of gut complications while your microbiome is vulnerable after antibiotics. However, as Kelly mentioned earlier, probiotics are strain-specific and are therefore disease-specific. So it is important to seek medical advice as to whether a probiotic supplement would be right for you. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Sam, who will be discussing more about fecal microbiota transplantation, also known as FMT, and how it can be used to remediate gut dysbiosis. I would like to acknowledge my supervisors, Dr. Damon and Dr. Gökhan, my colleague Rojbin for her support in putting this together, and also Dr. Lisa Budzinski for her scientific input and guidance. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks, Louisa. Just share my screen. So think yeah. Thanks. I'm Sam Costello. I'm a gastroenterologist. I work at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in South Australia and also at Biobank, and we're a microbiome therapeutics company that make fecal transplant and microbiome therapy. So um, we're really the focus of our research is working on the big problem of loss of human gut microbial ecology. So the previous two speakers have talked about why gut bacteria are necessary and important in our gut. They provide really many important functions for us. And we've seen a loss of gut microbes over the last 70 or so years. And during this time, there's been a number of really critical breakthroughs for humanity, including the advent of antibiotics and immunization and improved sanitation, which has really driven down the rates of infectious disease. Many of these diseases were lethal, and as a result, people have a much better quality of life. But we've also seen during this period of time increases in many chronic diseases, particularly those associated with autoimmune disease and allergy that have been associated with this problem of loss of gut microbes. And a condition that is probably most well described associated with a loss of gut microbes is a disease called C. difficile infection. So this is a nasty bacteria that can overgrow the bowel after antibiotics. It's more common in patients with immune deficiency. And it presents with a condition called pseudomembranous colitis, which you can see in this picture here. And fecal transplant is actually highly effective for this condition. And by putting back normal human gut microbiome into the gut of someone with C. difficile, you can actually cure the condition. So the study on the right compared the currently available or the previously available treatment, which were antibiotics, to fecal transplant and demonstrated that fecal transplant was far more effective than the then standard of care. So the issue with C. difficile infection is essentially antibiotics are the common cause of C. difficile, so killing off the healthy gut microbiome and creating an ecological space for C. difficile to expand into. And so fecal transplant works by really restoring that ecology and crowding out C. difficile, whereas antibiotic treatment, although they would have some effect against C. difficile, wouldn't correct the underlying problem, which was the loss of gut microbes. So I got involved in fecal transplant through undertaking research. In 2012, I went and visited a group in Finland who were doing fecal transplant, and at that time there was very little being done around the world, and they were one place that was performing this. And then I really wanted to do a clinical trial focused on fecal transplant for ulcerative colitis, so we set up a stool bank in an academic laboratory in Adelaide, where we screened donors and stored stool, and then started to supply local hospitals for patients with C. difficile. When we treated our first patient in 2013, we then since then have treated over 300 patients with fecal transplant. The pictures on the right were the first case I saw in Finland, and at the bottom, how we used to process the stool, which was fairly basic. But over the intervening years, we've established with the Therapeutic Goods Administration more rigorous protocols and actually set up Biobank as a way to produce fecal transplant as a pharmaceutical product with all of the checks and balances that you'd expect from a drug product. So that then became the world's first approved microbiome therapy in 2022, and that product is now supplied to over 100 hospitals around Australia. But also, concurrent with that work, we've really looked to develop cultured versions of that product, so culturing the individual gut microbes. So now we have over 37,000 individual isolates from of bacteria that have been derived from these healthy human donors, and over 1,000 human gut microbe species that we can then choose to develop more targeted therapies. And the reason that we've taken this approach is we know that fecal transplant can be very effective. There's now data to show that it can be effective not only in C. difficile infection, but also ulcerative colitis, inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, and some other conditions. The study on the right is one we undertook in ulcerative colitis. But it has a number of, and to give an idea of just an example of one patient we've treated to show the potential effect, FMT, and the fact it can be life-saving. There was a 69-year-old woman who was admitted to hospital with C. difficile infection. So she presented with symptoms of fever, abdominal pain, and diarrhea. She'd failed vancomycin, so antibiotic treatment, and had a sigmoidoscopy which showed these pseudomembranes, so this yellow plaque on the bowel. She deteriorated though and was admitted to intensive care with septic shock, and did not want to have a surgical procedure to remove her colon, understandably, which was a potential treatment, and so instead underwent fecal transplant and recovered within 24 hours. So no further C. diff colitis at follow-up. So this is a story that's fairly common with fecal transplant with C. difficile, and so it is a very gratifying therapy to deliver, but it has a number of limitations. So because it's from human donors, we can't control the composition, and so we can't. There's very variable donation to donation, and so we can't really enhance it for better efficacy or safety. And it's also difficult to produce, expensive to produce, and not really scalable to large populations that may need this therapy because it's human donor derived. On the other hand, we've got cultured products like probiotics, but unfortunately, single strain products have really lacked the efficacy that we've seen with donor-derived fecal transplant. And that's principally because the single strains don't carry the same function that a diverse microbiome has. And we say that a diverse microbiome has emergent therapeutic properties, so properties that exist in the whole community that are not evident in the individual strains themselves. But to get diverse products, you would say of 100 strains, traditionally you would need 100 different bioreactors or 100 different sort of factories to produce each, which has not been feasible. To have a look at currently available probiotics, on the right is what we call a phylogenetic tree. So this is all the individual strains that we have in the human gut or species, and those that we have in our culture collection at Biobank. But if you look at Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus, the two probiotics that are typically on the market in chemists, that represents less than 0.5% of the strains that you would, or species you'd have in the human gut. And so that's a tiny fraction of what's there. And so this is why probiotics, effectively, the ones that are available, just do not really make any impression on the gut microbiome when given compared to the breadth that you see in a fecal transplant. And so what we've done is really try to set about growing a fecal transplant. So we've mapped what are all the strains present in the human gut, tried to grow all of those, and then put them together and grow them together as one substance in a single bioreactor. So in that way, we really are aiming to try and help solve this big problem of loss of human gut microbes, but do so in a scalable way that acknowledges the diversity of what should be present. And so this gives one of the other challenges is not only growing them all, but having them in the relative abundance profiles that we'd normally see. So in the ocean, you might see sardines and great white sharks. You'd expect that the sardines are in much higher abundance than the white sharks, and that's normal in a healthy ecosystem. And similarly in the human gut, some microbes should be at low abundance and others at high. So we're trying to replicate that. And each of the blue lines are our cultured versions of a human microbiome, and we're getting closer and closer to the real thing, which is the orange line. We use fecal transplant studies, though, to point us in the right direction. And you can see this is a patient who responded to a fecal transplant, and each of the colors represents different bacterial strains. And you can see in the patient who gets better, they look more like the donor. And so we want those strains for the patient who goes into remission. And they're interesting to then pull out of our collection and put into a product targeting that disease. And so for this condition, ulcerative colitis, you can see this wheel on the right again represents instead of the human microbiome, that this is actually a product that we've constructed for this particular condition, picking individual, in this case, 100 different strains, each carrying specific disease targeting function. So it looks a much more like a fecal transplant than it does a traditional probiotic, which would only include 1 or 2 species. And so we're taking this approach now in a number of diseases. None of these are specifically immune deficiencies, but patients with these conditions often do take immune suppressing medication. And so, yeah, there's, I think there'll be products like this developed in the future for a range of conditions associated with this problem. And I'm happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Sam. I just have one question for you, which I might get you to answer now, if that's okay. So just contextually, we often hear that FMT is an important step in the development of microbiome therapies. I guess, can you explain what you've learned from FMT and how it's helping researchers develop the next generation of microbiome-based treatments? And secondly, are we moving more towards targeted therapies such as specific bacterial strains or cultured microbiome therapies?
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. So, yeah, we do use fecal transplant as a both as a therapeutic, so it is an effective treatment for some conditions, but also as a discovery tool to identify which strains might be associated with a remission or a cure post fecal transplant, and then we can look to grow those particular species or strains and put them into a targeted therapeutic. And the advantage of that might be that you can dose it. You can also ensure that there's no pathogens or no bad bacteria associated with that, and no risk of disease transmission. So by just taking the most sort of effective bacteria out of the mix. The other thing, though, that we've noted from fecal transplant studies are the emergent properties. So of a whole ecosystem. So diversity actually gives more therapeutic function than the individual strains that make up the whole. And we've found that if you take one strain out, even if that strain is highly associated with an effect in a fecal transplant, if you give it individually, it often will lose that effect without the other strains that are sitting around it. So that's why we think we need to take this diverse approach of having many strains together in culture rather than individual strains.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that, Sam, and for your presentation.
No worries. Thanks, Caroline.
So just moving on now, we have had a real variety of questions. Some of them you can see on my screen here. We are going to work with our speakers from tonight and develop these questions into a fact sheet, which will be available shortly to everyone who's registered on the webinar and to our IDFA community more broadly. We do think this is an important topic, and I think from the number of people who have attended tonight, it is important to our members. So we will be developing a resource based on these questions. I know there was also a range of other questions submitted, so the team at IDFA will review those and we'll work with the speakers to develop that fact sheet for you. So I just wanted to talk a little bit now as we come towards the end of the webinar about the current IDFA resources that we have. So we have resources available on nutrition and the immune system, primary immunodeficiencies and gastrointestinal disorders, primary immunodeficiencies and infections, staying healthy, a guide for patients and families, and more broadly, PID and fatigue. So we have all these in a downloadable format on our website. And if you would like hard copies, you can also request a hard copy free of charge from us. I just wanted to talk to you about the program that we have coming up for the rest of the year in relation to our webinars. So on the 30th of July at 12:30 to 1:15, we're trying a new format. We've got a lunch and learn presentation from the Australian Digital Health Agency. It's an introduction to digital health, and I think something that's really relevant to our members, which is around your health records being stored on your MyGov account. So please join us for that webinar if you can. That one unfortunately can't be recorded, so if you are able to listen in, that would be great. Our next evening webinar is Managing Fatigue with Immunodeficiency. That'll be held on Wednesday, the 26th of August, followed by Mental Health, Resilience and Wellbeing on Thursday, the 8th of October. And then we're going to be looking to the future of immunodeficiency care on the 9th of December. So we'll send out reminders about each of those webinars, but that's just an overview about what's coming up for the rest of the year. I wanted to really say thank you to all of our speakers tonight. So to Kelly, Louisa and Sam, thank you very much for your presentations. And I know how closely you've worked with my colleague Hannah, who I'd also like to thank, in putting those presentations together and in putting together what was an absolutely fabulous webinar and so informative to our members. I certainly learned a lot from that myself. So I'd like to now launch the polling questions and also thank the sponsors of our webinar, which is our pharmaceutical partner Grifols, who generously provide support for this webinar. So thanks again to our presenters. Thank you all for attending tonight. We will be sending the link to the recording out in coming days, and I'd like to wish you a lovely evening. Thank you.